Hi, Josie. Welcome to Wealthy, the Matriarch podcast. I'm excited to have you here today with us because of many reasons, but one of them is because I just finished reading your book. It's called Women, Money, Power, The Rise and Fall of Economic Equality. It was pretty thrilling to see the adventures of all these incredible women, and disappointing and thrilling at the same time. And I really love how you weave their stories through your book. And I have to say, as much as I've known about women's wage gap and equality and all the fights for equality, I didn't know a lot of the stories that you shared and about the women, the extraordinary women actually that fought for their financial freedom. And we sort of sit on their shoulders, I think, today. So I wanted to start, we're going to dive into all of the aspects of the book, but I wanted to just first start with you. Like, tell me about you. Like, where did you grow up? Where do you live now?
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me on. And as you can tell from my accent, I'm not originally from the US. So the experience of writing a book that charts women's economic empowerment and a history of women's economic empowerment in America was, of course, pretty daunting. I actually grew up in Switzerland in a very kind of multicultural family. My mom was originally from Czechoslovakia, so today the Czech Republic. My dad was originally from the UK. They moved to Switzerland in the very early 80s, late 70s. I initially went to a public school, so a Swiss school. Grew up speaking pretty much only German, at least outside of the house. In the house, we were speaking English. And then for high school, I ended up going to an international school. One of the reasons being that my mom was actually a teacher there. And so at the time, kids of teachers could get like free tuition, essentially, at these international schools. And that was a really interesting experience, just being thrust into this world of a very, diverse student body in many senses, but also a very privileged student body. I think that kind of exposed me to this idea of economic inequality, quite frankly, right? And so after that, I did my undergraduate degree in the UK to kind of explore my British heritage. And then I graduated from undergrad pretty much straight onto the back of the great financial crisis. So the recession in Europe. I knew I wanted to be a journalist. Needless to say, it was a pretty challenging time to be seeking out a job in the labor market. But my sort of superpower was that I had grown up bilingually and that I did, have those language skills that sort of set me apart in the world of journalism. And so I was very fortunate in that I stumbled upon a job for a junior markets correspondent. And so I took a job in Frankfurt straight out of college covering financial markets as a liberal arts major. That was kind of the beginning of my education and my fascination with this, money, power, gender kind of nexus. I quickly realized that being a financial markets reporter, it's not just about stocks going up and stocks going down. It's not just about the flow of currencies and commodities around the world. It's really about power, right? And it's about the reinforcement of power dynamics and who gets what say in the world. And it's about decision making and influence. Mm-hmm. And while, the sort of technicalities of basis points and bond yields didn't really sort of ignite a passion in me, the idea of reporting on power and influence and personalities and the human mind, that really did. And so, I always say that money is about so much more than money, right? Wealth is about so much more than wealth. And I hope that comes across in the book as well, which we can talk about.
Yes, for sure. What was the impetus for you then to write the book? Because you've done all kinds of, broadcasting and reporting and all of those things, and now you decided to write. Is this your first book?
It is.
Yes,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So what made you want to write this book specifically about this, and how was the experience actually of writing this book?
The answer to that question really leads me back to where I just left off around kind of the work I was doing initially as a financial markets reporter, and then having this kind of profound realization that money is about so much more than just money. It's about power. And one thing that I realized pretty early on was that the world of big money, as I like to describe it, so investments and, high net worth individuals, is so dominated by men, right?
Yes.
And it sounds very simplistic when I say it now, but I just couldn't really get my head around the fact that we've achieved so much as a humankind. We've cured complex diseases and we're sending people into space and we're doing all kinds of amazing things. And yet somehow this issue of inequality in the highest echelons of power is so vexing that we can't really get our heads around it. So after my initial job as a markets reporter in Frankfurt, I was working in London, initially for Reuters and then at the Wall Street Journal. And it was around that time that in the UK, the law changed and the gender pay gap reporting mandate came into effect. And under that mandate, companies employing at least 250 people had to every year publish their gender pay gap. This made it kind of this central pillar of business news coverage. And to me, that was super enlightening because of this data deadline and because of this compulsion to report. We had like black on white data showing the extent of the gender pay gap in corporations. Not only that, but we could also see where the gender pay gap starts to widen, right? Where a family, a couple decides to start a family, that is kind of the inflection point where this gender pay gap really begins to widen. Sort of in my personal life, things were happening as well that informed my passion to report on this and to make this kind of the focus of my work. I became a mom. We made a decision as a family that I would be the primary caregiver. I carried on working, but I was certainly picking up more of that unpaid labor, that load of childcare. Yes. Because it made sense for us. My husband was out earning. We were a classic case of, the typical heterosexual couple with a small child. And I just thought it was so fascinating that the economy is not fit for purpose, that this gender pay gap is still so entrenched, that it has barely moved, right? In this country, in the US, the gender pay gap has basically not moved for the last 20 years, which is wild. And so all of this was happening. And I just really found myself feeling like that is what I wanted to use my platform for, shining a light on this and asking these questions of why are we still where we are today? Why have we not moved further along? And then I had the opportunity to interview a business leader. And this person is a household name, very, very well-known business leader, very respected, extremely intelligent, highly accomplished. It was an off-the-record conversation, so I'll never be able to say who the person was. Right. But I asked him, I said, why do you think the gender pay gap still exists? Why do you think it's still so entrenched? And he said to me that what I had to understand was that sometimes when a woman takes a temporary leave of absence from the paid labor market to have a baby, to take a short maternity leave, when she comes back, she's just not as professionally ambitious as she was. And to me, this answer spoke volumes, right? Yes. One thing that this individual is doing by providing this answer is that he is placing the onus on women to fix themselves in order to fix a problem that is so systemic, right? And so complex.
This is very much our culture.
Yes, completely.
More self-help books and
totally. Yeah, it was very lean in, right? It was very much about like surely you can just assert yourself. Surely you can make choices that will, magically fix this problem. And I was so sad and I was so angry, but it was also a real realization that this is where we're at. These are the misconceptions that are shaping business culture. And that night I went home, I wrote the prologue to the book. And I decided to set out on this journey of asking myself, how did we get to where we are today? Where did we come from? What are the stories that we need to tell and understand and keep retelling?
Your book covers a lot of ground. I saw the evolution of women's lives over the last century. There is marriage, there is motherhood, there's career opportunity, there's corporate struggles, financial independence or not, political upheaval. And yet you sort of brilliantly connected the dots for us on all of these historical threads, and you put it in so through the stories of these women, which I thought it was a brilliant way to tell the story. How did you make the decision to structure the book that way through the stories of these people?
I decided to start during the Second World War because that was such an inflection point. It was a time when women in really meaningful numbers came into the paid labor market for the first time, many, out of necessity, right? It was a huge, large-scale social experiment. And the American economy needed women to prop up the labor market and to ensure that things could keep running, right, while the men were away, or predominantly the men were away at war. I also wanted to start there because I knew that these so-called Rosie the Riveters, and I use that term to describe any woman who moved into a, predominantly male-dominated domain during the war, some of them were still alive, right?
Right.
They are the youngest of which are now in their 90s, late 90s, mid to late 90s. And so I knew that we didn't have much time to hear from these women in person. And I thought, what an amazing privilege and an amazing opportunity to do that. And so that's where I began.
It's also really cool that all the women are so different, the stories you told, because their personalities are very, very different from each other. And yet they were so driven by the same thought, in many ways. I think that, like you said, you started in the 40s because of World War II, and women were forced to really take over the labor market. And some of them, like Rosie the Riveter, basically they were really helping with the war effort, right? They were patriots as well. But as a result, they actually got that taste of financial independence and the empowerment, and they felt useful and they made money. But then you tell the story about how obviously it was convenient and important for the government and for men that women would step up and do this. But then the war was over and men were coming back home, and then women were no longer needed as tools for safety, I'd say, for the United States of America. And so tell us a little bit about that time, because that must have been incredibly frustrating and horrible for these women to go back into what they were doing before.
Yeah, totally. And it was so important to me to tell that part of the story, because I think when we, as you say, when we tend to think of Rosie the Riveter and the women's wartime effort, we tend to think of this like elation and pride and patriotism and all these positive emotions of rolling up their sleeves and proving what they're capable of. And this is all super important. But as you say, there was this kind of letdown at the end where women felt a resentment towards the way in which society was treating them. And I characterize it as kind of like a rubber band snapping back into place, right?
Yes.
As you said, we saw these women essentially being forced back out of the labor force after the end of the war, back into the role of homemaker and unpaid laborer in the household. And I think that resentment really fueled something in subsequent generations. And even today, when I speak to some of these Rosie the Riveters, and one particular Rosie the Riveter who kind of became the central character in my main chapter, she speaks in very kind of honest ways about that feeling and that lingering resentment that she still feels, right? She still feels like Rosie the Riveter was cheated. Rosie the Riveter was not treated fairly in those circumstances, was not given her due, was not given the glory and the recognition and the acknowledgement that she deserves. And that's, as I say, that's what we see in subsequent generations. I think that the children of the Rosie the Riveters recognize that. I think that became a real engine and a real kind of fuel that powered the women's movement in later decades. And as I say, this is kind of like the sort of waterfall of events.
Yeah. And you also talk about how the boomer parents really made an effort into talking about the importance of their daughters to get jobs and get careers. Yes, because I think they felt that deeply as something that they got shortchanged on, and they tried to pass it to the next generation. Yes.
Yeah, totally. And one of the super fascinating pieces of research that I still dwell on today that I came across while reporting for this chapter was that, I really wanted to figure out whether the daughter of a Rosie the Riveter, so the daughter of a woman who worked in the paid labor market during the Second World War, was more likely to work in the paid labor market herself, right? And I couldn't find conclusive evidence that there was a correlation there, but I could find conclusive evidence that the son of a Rosie the Riveter, so the son of a woman who worked during the Second World War, was more likely to be married to someone who worked, right? A woman who worked. And I just thought that was so interesting. This like cultural openness to women working and to women earning money did translate, and it did kind of filter down. It was just not perhaps in the way that I initially expected.
So you have this generation where they felt shortchanged. Much has happened during that time. I mean, obviously a lot has improved. After the war, there's the baby boom. There's confidence of a rebounding economy, people were conceiving early, actually. Women would have like 2 to 3 kids before 25 years old. But contraception was hard to come by. It wasn't like widely available as we have it today. And that really limited the ability for women to go back into a career, to embark in any career, really. And so a lot of those women that of that generation started to really feel even more shortchanged, right? I know that I think you mentioned like the latex condoms started to get more mass produced, but they were banned. They couldn't mail it. So there's all kinds of restrictions, right? And then employers could legally fire pregnant women, or refuse to hire pregnant women until like mid 60s. When you think about these dates, it's pretty insane, right? They could refuse to hire pregnant women. Companies, they would actually ask women that were pregnant to resign. So then you tell the story of this woman that I did not know, which is really remarkable. Her name was Katharine McCormick. She was this very wealthy woman that actually had a pretty tragic relationship with her husband that suffered from mental illness, and they were separated for most of their marriage. So there was the sadness, but the husband was very wealthy and she inherited a lot of money, and she went on doing all kinds of things, including smuggling diaphragms. Can you tell me that story? I never heard of that story before.
Oh, yeah. I mean, honestly, it's so hard to choose who my favorite character is in the book, but Katharine Dexter McCormick certainly comes close
something.
I mean, she's just, her life, stranger than fiction. As you say, she was born in the 1870s in the Midwest.
Totally.
She was one of the first women to graduate from MIT. She studied biology there. Yes, as you say, she was from a very wealthy family. She married into a wealthy family. Her husband got very sick right after their marriage in the early 1900s. But she pretty early on became obsessed with this idea of birth control and this idea that, how would women be able to live differently if we could separate sex and reproduction? If we could somehow ensure that a woman could plan her kind of biological life and her rhythms and when she wants to start a family. Both her brother and her father passed away when she was a teenager, and she was very close with both of them. So she really, really was fascinated by the human body, how it works and how it fails. And that was only reinforced when her husband got so sick. And so she started thinking about birth control. She encountered Margaret Sanger, who of course is a much more prominent figure in women's history than Katharine Dexter McCormick. And together they sort of came up with this notion of a magic pill, of some kind of contraceptive pill that a woman could take, that was sort of discreet and affordable and accessible and reliable and safe. And it would take years, of course, to become a reality. But the long story short is that the research that was being done into this was so controversial at the time. Contraception was very much outlawed in the US during those years. And so as a result of that, also any kind of academic research, any kind of scientific research was not only, underfunded, it was also deemed very unethical. But Katharine didn't see it that way. And so she actually ended up using the vast majority of her, or a huge portion of her wealth, and funded much of the research and development that went into making the first oral contraceptive pill that became available in 1960 in this country, making that a reality. And it just really baffles me that despite the immense impact that the pill had on women's lives, on reproductive health, on reproductive access, on women's professional existence, on their freedoms and their independence, despite all that, no one's really heard of Katharine Dexter McCormick. She was the one who ultimately made this possible. And yet her name has really been obscured by history. And I think it's really sad. And one of my missions off the back of this book is to tell her story widely and to repeat it over and over again, and to, just use this as inspiration as well at this time when we are facing a war on reproductive access in this country. Reproductive rights are under severe threat. But just to remind ourselves that there have been figures in history who have really overcome immense adversity to fulfill their mission. Oh, and also, of course, the original question you had was about the diaphragms. So one of the things that Katharine did, one of the things that Katharine did was that because she was very educated and because she had this firm belief that women should have access to to contraception, she traveled to Europe where she pretended to be a medical supplies buyer. And contraceptive diaphragms were readily available across a lot of Europe, much of Europe, in a way that they weren't in America. And she posed as a medical supplies buyer. She bought dozens and dozens of diaphragms, and then she smuggled them back into the US by sewing them into the linings of her coats and dresses. Which is like the best story ever, right? And she did this, I think it was for 3 or 4 years. Every summer she would come over to Europe and she would stage this quite amazing operation. And during that time, you know, she smuggled, I think it was about 1,000 diaphragms back into this country, that she then distributed from one of Margaret Sanger's birth control clinics. So truly, I think this speaks to her, you know, ingenuity, her courage, her creative thinking, and just the spirit that she had of not being, you know, intimidated by social mores, by norms, by laws, and by any kind of expectations that she didn't agree with at that time.
I love that story. She was also a big donor of the American Birth Control League. Isn't that later named Planned Parenthood? Is that the old name for Planned Parenthood? Is that
Correct.
It is, right? Yes.
Yes.
So, I mean, she was also responsible for, you know, funding that from the very beginning. So her contributions definitely are.
Yeah, she was, you know, beyond the birth control rights, she was really such an important figure in the suffrage movement. Mm-hmm. She truly believed in women's rights in education, in every aspect of life. Being one of the first women ever to go to MIT, there was a law or a regulation at MIT at the time, and I think across Harvard as well, that women had to wear hats in science laboratories. And she campaigned across the university to have this law abolished because she just said that it was such a dumb law, right? It was like a fire hazard to have these women with these like big hats in science labs. I think it's so illustrative of just how rooted in the real world she was, you know, and how she appreciated that there were just some things that made absolutely no logical sense. She wanted more women in higher education. She wanted more women in medicine. She actually endowed a residence at MIT that still stands today. It's called McCormick Hall. And when I was doing research on her, I spent a lot of time in Cambridge, Massachusetts at MIT. And I spent a good afternoon outside McCormick Hall, outside this residence, asking all the people coming in and going out whether they knew who McCormick was. And I was really shocked to learn that really nobody knew anything about her. So again, just an example of, you know, how her life has been erased by history. And it was actually only in April this year that the New York Times published an obituary of Katharine Dexter McCormick. Yeah, they have a series that's dedicated to correcting the narrative through history and publishing obituaries for people who have historically been overlooked.
Wow.
And they published Katharine Dexter McCormick's obituary, which made me very happy, but also, you know, it just shines a light on the extent to which she's really been forgotten and her contributions have just not been acknowledged.
Truly. You also mentioned Betty Friedan, who is more well known, a lot more well known in the 60s. So at that time in the 60s, the civil rights movement was in full swing. I think it was then that you mentioned that Gloria Steinem went undercover. It was her infamous, you know, she was dressed as a Playboy bunny. And I also did not know that. I knew about Gloria. I didn't know that Marilyn Monroe had a nude photo published in Playboy without her consent. That's insane. I mean, that's totally insane. So at that time in the 60s, Betty's book, The Feminine Mystique, hit the stores. I think it was 8 days after Sylvia Plath died. She talks about the problem that has no name. So tell us what that is and what was the impact of her book, The Feminine Mystique?
As you say, The Feminine Mystique was such a bombshell, right? It really was unlike anything that had ever been published before. As you say in it, she describes the problem that has no name, which is that women are frustrated, right? This was the 1960s. This was a time when women were starting to get a flavor of having their own lives, of having economic independence, of making decisions, of of having birth control, of being able to decide when they wanted to start a family and how they wanted to structure their lives. And yet the sort of expectations and social norms were still so restrictive. And she acknowledged this and she wrote about this and she really put into words what so many people were thinking and what was still shrouded in so much kind of taboo and secrecy, right? It was really frowned upon in many communities for women to complain about the roles that they had in families and in society.
Right.
And Betty was pissed off, right? She was over
Rightly
it.
so.
And so she wrote this book that really became a kind of Bible, a sort of manifesto for a new feminist movement. And I decided to tell her story in conjunction with the story of Pauli Murray.
Yes.
Who is another person who is not a household name, and another person whose story I have been trying to tell at any given opportunity, because I think it's so important to recognize the contributions that Pauli Murray made, particularly to that time in history when Betty Friedan was doing all her important work as well. Mm-hmm. So Betty Friedan co-founded the National Organization of Women now, and her co-founder was Pauli Murray. Pauli Murray was a legal scholar. She was a civil rights activist. She was in later life an Episcopal priest. She was a poet. She was a writer. She was just this incredible individual who really had this unique ability to recognize injustice, to recognize things like intersectionality, mm-hmm. to recognize that injustice didn't just run along lines of gender or lines of race, but it sort of ran along every line, and that the complexity of that was something that we all have a duty to understand. She crafted a lot of the legislation that became the civil rights laws that we all depend on today to be able to live, good lives. Mm-hmm. So she had written to President Roosevelt to complain about segregation in higher education. And through that, she met Eleanor Roosevelt. She became kind of a mentor to her and a friend as well. She also was one of the first women to be hired by a white shoe law firm in New York. And during that time, she had a summer intern whose name was Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
How about that?
So she became this kind of mentor and teacher to the late Supreme Court Justice. And it was actually arguably towards the end of her life, she did talk a lot about Pauli Murray and the extent to which we all stand upon Pauli Murray's shoulders, the gratitude that we all owe Pauli Murray and her courage. And, I can't believe how much she contributed to the fabric of modern America. I also had the utter privilege of getting in touch with her family after the publication of my book. And I've become quite close with her niece, who is herself a civil rights activist in her 80s now.
I know that Eleanor Roosevelt, when she was dying, wrote a letter to her as well. Yes,
she did. Yeah. And just acknowledging that Pauli Murray was very much sort of a moral compass to her throughout her life, and that she is sort of the unsung hero of American history. I think that's such a powerful image of these two women from such different backgrounds, such different kind of contexts and upbringings and privileges, to have forged this really special relationship and to know that they gain so much from each other. The final thing I'll say about Pauli Murray is that actually one of the things that the current Trump administration has done is it has erased some of the history from the National Parks Service's websites. And recently, a few weeks ago, I was alerted to the fact that Pauli Murray's biography is no longer posted on the National Park Service website, likely because of her affiliations with the LGBTQ plus community. And I just think it's an utter tragedy to be trying to erase such a formative part of history, an individual who was so selfless in their pursuit of common justice. And I think that should be even more of a reason for us to keep telling her story. Yes. It's hard to overstate the significance of the work that she did and the impact that she had.
Okay, so I wanted to talk to you about something that I thought a lot about, how the 90s had really amazing, empowered women. We had Madonna, we had Missy Elliott, Alanis Morissette, we had the Spice Girls. And then Carla Fiorina from HB got fired, and there was a whole thing. I remember even back then when I saw her going up the ranks and then getting blamed for a lot of things. And I just had a hunch that it was surely she must have made some mistakes as well. But it was just like, okay, was she just put in there because she's a woman and now she's taken the fall? So talk a little bit about the glass cliff.
Yeah. Yeah. So, as you say, a lot of us are familiar with the term the glass ceiling, the sort of invisible barrier that keeps women from rising through corporate ranks or political ranks to the very top of leadership. But when I learned about this glass cliff, something really clicked, and it, as you say, it kind of all made sense. So the glass cliff is effectively describes the fact that women tend to be put in positions of leadership when the chances of failure are particularly high. And specifically when the chances of failure are high because of external factors that are beyond their control. So nothing to do with their competence or their skill or their talent, but just when the stakes are such that, the economy or macroeconomic factors or anything else might effectively mean that they have to be sort of, pushed in front of the bus or whatever. And I think that, once you sort of learn about that concept, you start seeing it everywhere. You see that women are often more likely than men to be treated as kind of dispensable, to be sort of scapegoats when it comes to situations where somebody has to be kind of sacrificed, somebody has to kind of take the fall. And I think, Carly Fiorina is the example that I write about in the book. There are many, many others. And then what happens is that, one woman's failure, if we can describe it as such, is sometimes held up as an example of a lack of competence on behalf of all women. So we sort of over-index on the fact that this one woman who was put into an impossibly challenging position of power at a really, really difficult time somehow fails to fulfill her mandate because of factors beyond her control. But the fact that she fails to fulfill her mandate is then chalked up as evidence of the fact that women simply, aren't capable of doing these jobs of men. And it speaks to this double bind of the 90s that you sort of began to allude to. So in many ways, we'd reached this point where, women were moving into positions of power. CEOs of Fortune 500 companies were women. Women were moving into powerful positions in government and in the economy and in culture, of course, as well. And yet at the same time, kind of culturally, there was this real backlash against the feminism that was kind of becoming evident. And once again, as has been the case in every decade that I've chronicled in this book, it was sort of a fall and rise. It was kind of progress and then backlash. And that is something that I captured in the subtitle of the book, right? The rise and fall of economic equality. Every time we take a step forward, we somehow take a step back. And that's something that we're seeing today as well.
Let's talk about money for a second. Was money something that you openly discussed in your family?
Yeah. I'd say we didn't not openly discuss it, right? There was never a kind of sense that we couldn't talk about it. We were a strong family unit. It was my sister and my parents, so the four of us. And there was certainly a kind of understanding within our family that we could talk about anything, which I think is just such a beautiful thing, right? To have that trust and to have that transparency and that openness. We were never, we were very middle class, I think. We were comfortable, but never wealthy. I was fortunate enough never have to worry about money.
I think that, we have several examples, I think, for the audience, for the listener, to really go back into the book, because there are several examples of the women that you talk about, and we didn't have time to go over today, and how important it was for them to make sure that women understood finance and have financial literacy, and these women were fighting for that way back in the day. And I am a huge proponent of that today as well. I mean, I feel like even after going to business school and, I didn't major in finance, but it's still something that I didn't grow up talking about or studying or looking into. And it would have helped me tremendously in my, younger years, like in my 20s, for example, and then finally, what would you do if you could choose one thing to do with $1 billion? If I gave you $1 billion today, what would you do with it? You can only pick one thing.
$1 billion is $1 billion is a lot of money, but not also not enough, for the kind of systemic change. I think literacy is a superpower, right? So using that money to fund kind of financial literacy programs would be one way to put it to work and put it to work effectively. I sit on the board of a charity that does workplace training for women who are living at or below the poverty line in New York. And that board work has really showed me how far a dollar can go, right? And how far money can go to changing people's lives if they have access to training and education and opportunities and connections. I think training, education, which then allows people to be in the right room to make the connection that is going to help them reach their professional and their economic potential, is huge. But,
Sure.
there are so many great ways in which that money could be spent. I think one of the fundamental problems in this country and one of the fundamental barriers to economic equality is a lack of affordable childcare, reliable childcare. I think that this country still does not have a social security network that supports families, and the onus for childcare still falls on the individual, and that is not okay. So if that money could be put towards somehow enshrining a more equitable, reliable system of childcare, then that would also be certainly a worthy cause.
I agree. Josie, I want to thank you for your time. Thank you so much for writing this book. It's much needed. I think I'm going to be giving this book to many, many people because, like you said, I think it's worth retelling the stories of these amazing women. And I'm so grateful for your work and for everything that you're doing. Just keep up the amazing work that you're doing.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me, Patricia. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Wealthy, the Matriarch podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, it would mean so much to me if you shared this with someone. Make sure to follow or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and head to matriarch.com to stay connected. I'm your host, Patricia Asui Reed. Thank you so much for being here.